like all I could see was the struggle, haunted by ghosts that lived in my past, bound up in shackles of all my failures, wondering how long is this gonna last. You look at this prisoner and say to me, son, stop fighting a fight that's already been won. 'Cause I am redeemed. You set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains and wipe away every stain. Now I'm not who I used to be. 'Cause I am redeemed. I am redeemed. All my life I've been called unworthy, named by the voice of my shame and regret. When I hear you whisper, child, lift up your head, I remember, oh God, you're not done with me yet. 'Cause I am redeemed. You set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains and wipe away every stain. 'Cause I'm not who I used to be. Because I don't have to be the old one inside of me. 'Cause his day is long dead and gone. Because I've got a new name, a new life, I'm not the same, and a hope that will carry me home. 'Cause I am redeemed. You set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains and wipe away every stain. No, I'm not who I used to be. 'Cause I am redeemed. You set me free. So I'll shake off these heavy chains and wipe away every stain. Now I'm not who I used to be. 'Cause I am redeemed. Yeah, I am redeemed. Thank God, redeemed. 'Cause I am redeemed.
Our scripture passage this morning comes from the book of Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. Hear now the word of the Lord. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, Your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. Good morning, Trinity UMC. My name is Molly Lorden. I am the associate pastor at Normal Heights UMC, just down the road from all of you. It's a pleasure to be with you virtually this morning to offer some thoughts on the passage for us to consider together today. A quick fun fact about me that you will understand the relevance to in just a moment is that I love musical theater. I grew up going to see musicals. I acted in shows in middle and high school. And one of the main reasons, well, okay, maybe not the main, but a reason that I chose to go to Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey for my master's in divinity was its proximity to New York City and direct access to seeing Broadway shows. While I was there, my friends and I would enter all the Broadway lotteries daily, often jumping in the car at the last minute because one of us scored tickets to a show. And it's my love of musical theater that influenced me as I prepared the sermon on this passage, as a refrain from a song repeated in my mind as I was reflecting and writing. It goes, "Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story?" These questions echo throughout and finally close the musical Hamilton, reminding us that we have no control who lives, who dies, and who tells our story. The final song in the musical recounts the work not of Alexander Hamilton, but of his wife Eliza. It repeats this refrain about who tells our story when we're gone, and ends with Eliza looking towards the audience, and then a moment where she gasps and the lights go dark. We're not told what this gasp means, but one interpretation of this moment is that the fourth wall, the wall between stage and audience, has been lifted, and she sees that her story has been told. I love this interpretation because it causes me to wonder if the whole musical is really about her, the woman of whom so much less was written when compared to her husband, at least. And although the musical follows the life of Alexander with great detail, the title of the musical, being Hamilton and not Alexander, leaves the door open for it really to have been about Eliza all along. In that vein, this refrain, "Who lives, who dies, who tells your story," is both an admission that history is told by the victors and those with power, and an invitation to tell the stories of those that have been lost, forgotten, or silenced. The musical calls this idea of a dual narrative of our history as a country to the forefront, recounting the history of historical white men portrayed by a cast made up of people of color, reminding us in every moment that underneath the history lies the stories that have been left out of our history books. The stories of enslaved peoples, indigenous peoples, women, and all those who have been oppressed and marginalized. So as we ask ourselves, who tells our story, we must also ask, what stories have not been told? In our scripture passage today with Bartimaeus, there are also two stories being told that we must recognize. One sees him as an object of pity and an interruption to the real story. The other tells us the story from his position and lets him teach us. Our scripture passage this morning opens with Jesus and the disciples coming to Jericho, but as quickly as they arrive, we're told they left. It's a curious detail in the story that might leave us wondering why it was included in the first place, other than that's where the story took place. But as we're going to see in our passage, There's a double meaning at hand throughout the story, which is foreshadowed in this detail about it taking place as they were outside the city of Jericho. For part of the Jewish people's history, we might remember well, takes place outside this city. There's shouting. There's disruption, and then the walls come tumbling down. The inclusion of this detail of their location outside the city of Jericho leaves us wondering if something similar is about to happen. So, as they were leaving the city, it says, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. Not exactly clear to us here in the English translation is that by saying Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, they're actually repeating his name, for Bartimaeus in Hebrew literally translates to son of Timaeus. Mark, the pithiest gospel writer, who doesn't often elaborate, takes the time to call attention to his name. And characteristically of the Hebrew language of which his name was rooted, his name can have many meanings. His name can either mean honored one or son of the ransomed one. It can also mean the one who is impure. The story doesn't tell us how to translate it. It just lets it be. What is interesting about the translation of his name as ransomed one is that Israel is referred to this way several times in the Hebrew scriptures. And so while we may not be able to say definitively what his name means, the history of its use as referring to Israel and the location of the story being Jericho sits with us as we continue reading. When Bartimaeus hears that it is Jesus the Nazarene who is coming by, he begins to shout and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me, which means there is symmetry here. To say someone is the son of David was to say that they are the continuation of God's work in Israel. But this is not how the crowds had named Jesus. They relayed that he was Jesus of Nazareth. They understood one aspect of his lineage or his story as being from Nazareth. But then Bartimaeus shouts. Bartimaeus shouts, and he is the son of David, which means they are linked. He, the son of Israel, names Jesus as the son of David for the first time, seeing what the crowd could not. It is clear from the crowd that they hear Bartimaeus as an interruption, and so they begin to rebuke him and tell him to be quiet. But why? They are outdoors, and Jesus is not teaching, just walking past. Maybe it's because their story of Jesus is different. Or maybe it's more insidious than that. For we know the power that comes with being able to guide the narrative. Either way, Bartimaeus is an interruption in their eyes. Another weird moment here relating to the two interpretations of Bartimaeus' name is the word for rebuke. Our translation that I read for us earlier says the crowd sternly ordered him to be quiet. But the word used is actually much stronger, the word for rebuke, which is surprisingly similar to the root of the name Timaeus. This word for rebuke can mean to make silent because someone's voice is deemed unworthy, but can also mean to honor and lift up a voice. While it seems clear that the crowd meant the former, wishing he would be silent and trying to make him so, it doesn't negate the existence of the latter. That in his shouting outside of Jericho, his voice is honored and lifted up. Again, there are two stories happening at the same time. And Bartimaeus continues to shout even louder, Jesus stops and says, "Call him here." So the crowd says to Bartimaeus, in an almost jarring turn of tone, "Take heart, he is calling you." So he throws off his cloak and comes to Jesus. Although we don't know it yet at this point in the story, it turns out the throwing of his cloak down perhaps starts something, because it is in the next story where Jesus enters Jerusalem and people throw their cloaks down again for Jesus in the same manner. Jesus then addresses Bartimaeus individually and without assumption, but with great care and compassion asks, "What do you want me to do?" Bartimaeus says, "Rabbi, let me see again." And here we have another moment in which Bartimaeus names Jesus for the first time, this time as Rabbi. Jesus responds and says, "Your faith has made you well." Then it says Bartimaeus regains his sight. But before the story ends, one last twist. Although Jesus tells him to go, he doesn't. Instead, he follows Jesus on the way. It's an interesting contrast with the rich young ruler in an earlier passage, who Jesus asks to follow him, but instead goes away. So what is the story here? On the one hand, and from one perspective, it's a story about Jesus reaching out and allowing himself to be interrupted by a man that the crowd tries to silence, a man without sight who is healed. But on the other hand, and with equal weight in the story, it's a story of how Bartimaeus, as the son of Israel, names the son of David, and how one who is silenced by the crowd is the one who teaches the crowd. It's a story about one without sight, who sees most clearly who Jesus really is. And the one who is told to go becomes the one who follows, and maybe even leads the way into Jerusalem as the crowd tosses their cloaks before Jesus. Well, which is the story here? Is Bartimaeus the one without sight, or is he the one who sees most clearly? Is he a beggar silenced by the crowd, or is he their teacher? Is he the esteemed one or the impure? Finally, is he the interruption to the story, or is he the story? Well, I guess that's for each one of us to decide, because it is not only a question for them, but it is our question today. How do we see the story of Christ? And where do we see the Spirit acting today? Because our question is the same as the question of the story. A story of class and economics, a story of histories. Do we, like the crowd, far too often imagine ourselves to be the sole bearers of the story to the world? As Howard Thurman, a theologian from the 1950s, writes, "Again and again, our missionary appeal is on the basis of Christian responsibility to the poor. But in this there is also a lurking danger, a hidden contempt which ensues as the sin of pride, an arrogance when we imagine ourselves to be the center of the story, while others only receive it, or worse, interrupt it." Friends, the dynamic over and over in the story of Christ, this poor Jewish man, oppressed under the heel of Rome, is that he hears and learns and receives from others, notably from those who have even less than he has. This is one way that we see that he inverts the world. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Why, the rich young man goes away in grief, and Bartimaeus leads the parade. Because Jesus is always about the valleys made high and the mountains made low. Part of following Christ is listening for the histories and stories of those that have been obscured by what the world and its conquerors deem to be the story or the history. It's not that the history of the oppressed is just an alternative history, but perhaps the primary story God is writing. So the story of our economy is found in the vast numbers of people who are refusing to return to work because of unfair wages and working conditions. The truth about our bodies are taught to us by those who are disabled. The story of what God is doing in the world is being spoken by those who are understood to be interruptions or expendable. And as they shout and proclaim the truth to power, the walls will come tumbling down. For those of us who find ourselves already in the story of Bartimaeus, an announcement: the kingdom is yours. Our story is tied up in the story of Christ, the one who makes the valleys high and the mountains low. It is a story we are invited to tell. And whether you shout it at the top of your lungs or whisper it in someone's ear, as you tell your story, the walls will come tumbling down. Friends, the musical Hamilton concludes by saying, we have no control who lives, who dies, who tells our stories. And on the first 2 points, I'll concede. But I disagree with the last point, because we are the storytellers. So let us tell the story of Christ, the one who listens, learns, and receives from others, notably from those who have even less than he has. The one who makes the valleys high and the mountains low, the one who inverts power dynamics and whose spirit is at work all around us. Shout it, and the walls will come tumbling down. Amen.